So actually, I had my share of exposure during this entire conference. So I'm going to be talking very briefly and actually let Sarah really take you into a discussion, which I think is very important. And the idea of that paper was actually coming out from discussion and some frustration that Sarah and I were having, and we decided to kind of talked about this today and thought that we need to have a kind of a community discussion around the concept of medicalization. So this is a bit kind of the overview of our presentation today. We're going to introduce you to the concept of medicalization, look at some example and some of the tension within this paradigm. So if you don't know what medicalization is, there's actually many definitions available, but generally speaking, it is thought as a process in which parts of human life are being framed within the medical language of healthy and illness. It is a conceptual phenomenon used to understand the regulation of deviant behavior, such as unprotected sex, stages of life like aging and andropause, and approaches to preventive medicine that regulate daily life. Once there is medicalization, that can lead to another long word that I'm going to attempt to pronounce, which is pharmaceuticalization, which is the process that deems social, behavioral, and bodily condition as needing a pharmaceutical treatment, i.e. some pills or surgery. So, as you're probably aware, homosexuality and medicine has had a long, historical, uncomfortable relationship. We've been a sin before. The first discussion of homosexuality as an illness appeared in the late 1800s. In the 1940s, there was we see a lot of increase in terms of treatment search for psychology or psychiatric cure of homosexuality. In the 1950s and the 70s, 1950s and 60s, we became classified within the DSM and the World Health Organization. And you know what happened in the 80s? There was the HIV epidemic that started, and that became another site where medicalization occurred. And we have to really think through that, you know, this history, although now homosexuality is not recognized as an illness anymore, has a long history and had left its mark. And still today, there's still debate about trying to find, you know, what caused homosexuality, and there's still cure and treatment that are available even in Canada. So why talking about medicalization today? This is a Viagra coaster that was available at all your good gay bars during Pride Festival in Vancouver and probably another place in Canada. And that may be a sign that there is a growing interest from pharmaceutical to kind of sell us some medication. And although the Viagra example might have been in plain sight of us during Pride, I think this is very it's a very small thing considering the medicalization that appear within HIV prevention. And I'll leave it to, is that? So, that's still me, I think. I'm talking too much. Medical intervention are increasingly visible within HIV prevention, and we can just think about the importance of things like PrEP and treatment as prevention in the scientific literature, and also it has gained huge importance within also the community discourse, and often we haven't really think through the limitation and challenges of those approaches. So I think what we believe is there really need to be a discussion on the limitation of those approach, especially if they are made at the detriment of social determinants and health promotion approaches.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to just apologize at the beginning. I'm recovering from whooping cough, so my voice might not hold up for this whole presentation, but I'm very hopeful, so we'll see. So I guess just to get started with some of the examples of medicalization that are pretty prominent. So internalized homophobia, the language even of men who have sex with men, the prescribed idea of healthy sex that public health has kind of sold people, and then of course the pharmaceutical developments around post and pre-exposure prophylaxis and treatment, and especially recently the push towards treatment as prevention. And also, as Olivier talked about earlier in the summit, kind of the allocation of gay men's health funding is also really tied to some medical outcomes. So the three examples that I'm going to talk about are internalized homophobia and then prescribing healthy sex, as well as some of the pharmaceutical developments. So to speak first about internalized homophobia, that's kind of one of the longer-standing historical examples of medicalization within gay men's health. And so I've thrown up a definition here, although I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this, but it's the feelings of inferiority, being evil, lacking self-worth and social value, or guilt, shame, and depression in gay men. And it's very much a psychological diagnosis that's been made, and it has been removed from some of the more formal aspects, but there's definitely still a lot of psychology that's kind of based on this idea. And Aguinaldo has done some really interesting work in an article called Homophobia is Killing Us, which really positions internalized homophobia as a gay men as having damaged psychologies because of internalized homophobia, and really links this to becoming a determinant of health. So instead of looking at structural factors, which is a theme we've talked about lots at this summit, it's gay men who have these damaged psychologies that are the problem. And so as a result, the individual becomes a site of intervention, and things like counseling are used to kind of repair the damage so that these men can go and have healthy sex lives and not experience these health inequities that we talk about often. So prescribing healthy sex is another way that individuals are kind of held responsible for their HIV status and their outcome. And so public health does a lot of work to try and make it look easy. Just follow these 3 simple rules, and you too can be HIV negative, which is really problematic because the ability of individuals to kind of follow through on these directions is really contextual, depending on lots of systems of oppression, but also kind of things like pleasure and desire, which we tend to associate with sex when we're not wearing kind of our public health hats. And so, again, this just kind of reiterates that preventing HIV is an individual responsibility, and there's been some really excellent work kind of in the late 1990s that I think is still really important to talk about today, about gay men feeling the need to kind of showcase their good behavior in following these 3 simple rules, which is, again, like really kind of restricts other parts of sexual expression and sexual identity often. So pharmaceutical development, this one is perhaps a little bit more controversial, but there's some really important things to talk about when we're talking about pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis, and treatment as prevention. Again, these are very much positioned as an individual needing to adhere to these drugs, like we've just heard. But again, and Trina's presentation did a really good job, actually, of kind of drawing attention to the fact that access to and uptake of these interventions are socially patterned, and some of those patterns are related to knowledge, cost, and adherence. So at summits before this, we've talked about post-exposure prophylaxis, and access to that for non-occupational exposure in Vancouver is very limited. It's expensive, and you need to know about it to be able to access it within a very brief window period, and that's something that not everyone is aware of. So some of the tensions in medicalization, I'm going to be talking about the tensions that are kind of presented by sexual rights, but also a health equity paradigm. So first off, and a lot of presentations have kind of drawn attention to this throughout the summit, which is great, but what about pleasure when it comes to sex? And kind of acknowledging the desire to have sex without a condom is something that public health doesn't really do a great job of, and in a lot of cases for very valid reasons. But I think it's quite important to start challenging ourselves to provide sexual health information in a way that acknowledges this. It also kind of restricts sexual expression and sexual identities, because it's not really okay to be talking about the condomless sex that you had this weekend, or having your legs up in a swing at F212, as Olivier said earlier. That's not something that can get talked about in a lot of social spaces, and so what that means for sexual expression and sexual identity can mean different things for different people. So as the sexual health rights literature points out, and we talked about again a lot at the summit, sexual health is systematically shaped by multiple forms of structural violence, and there's a list there for you that's definitely not inclusive of all of them, but points out a few of them. And it typically harms and negatively affects groups and populations that are already marginalized and oppressed. And so this kind of brings us to a discussion of the health equity implications of medicalization. And I also really like this quote because just as it's important to recognize that health and wellness are patterned along these lines of oppression, so are access to these individual level interventions that a lot of public health work keeps talking about as being the most important thing. So like I've just said, the ability of individuals to adopt medical interventions is very much shaped by systemic and structural factors. And again, to refer to that Aguinaldo article, which I just love, he talks about those who suffer because of oppression are responsible to solve it rather than the people who are creating that. And so he talked about that very much in the context of internalized homophobia, but I really think that it applies to a lot of these other interventions that I've talked about as well. And as well, focusing on these individual interventions really leaves the systems of oppressions intact so that future generations of people and other people will continue to experience those systems and continue to need counseling and these more kind of individual level interventions to address the issues. And when we're talking about gay men's health, there's been also a lot of attention drawn to the fact that it's not just HIV that we're talking about. And so really looking at these systems of oppression can help us address some of the other inequities in gay men's health beyond just HIV. So to, I guess, trying to drive the point home a little bit, that it's really important that the way that public health approaches sexuality, because of the fact that there's not too many institutions that talk about sex in our society. We have quite strong messages from the media, and historically there's been quite strong messages from the church, but neither of those institutions really provides kind of a very sex-positive presentation of sexuality, especially when we're talking about gay men. So I think as public health starts to adopt the sexual rights framework and really incorporate that into our work, the way we talk about sex and sexuality will have to change, and hopefully that will help change some of the other systemic issues that kind of arise from here. So in conclusion, or getting to the end, I guess, there's definitely a place for medical interventions in a lot of gay men's health work, but it has the potential both to affirm and deny sexual rights and health equity. So it's important that we kind of address some of these considerations that we wanted to raise today when we were talking. So there's definitely a need to operationalize all sexual rights and not just to information. So that means talking about sexual pleasure and sexual expression and sexual identity and creating safe spaces for people to be able to do that. And we've also seen lots of work showing that that's kind of that impacts the ability to access sexual health information. So even from that very more biomedical perspective, it's important to be doing so as well. We also need to really do some work to address the gradients of access to existing individual level interventions. So that not only includes like having access to a condom, but being able to use it in a specific sexual encounter, if that's what somebody would like to do. And then, of course, the need to balance kind of individual level interventions with more upstream interventions, looking at systems and structures. And so just to put up this image as kind of the very last one, this is an image from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation campaign around PrEP. And this isn't intended to be a comment on PrEP, but more the idea of regardless of what the pill is, if there is a magic pill, who is saying it's a magic pill? And then if we accept that definition that it is magic, we really need to pay attention to how we're distributing it, who has access to it, and how adherence to that pill would work. So thank you very much for your time.